The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people settled into their seats. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that always lingered before a verdict was handed down. At the bench, Judge Judy sat unmoved, her sharp eyes scanning the file in front of her. Decades in the courtroom had given her an unshakable presence, firm, unyielding, and always in control. The defendant stood before her, a young man, mid-20s, dressed in a wrinkled suit. His hands were clenched together, his shoulders tense. He had been here before his record showed it. Parole violations, petty theft. A past that spoke louder than his words ever could. Judge Judy sighed, tapping her pen against the desk. "You again." A quiet chuckle rippled through the audience, but the young man didn't smile. He kept his head down. She glanced at the case file again. Another mistake. Another second chance wasted. Or at least, that's what she thought, until he spoke. "Your Honor, before you decide, there's something you need to know." Judge Judy narrowed her eyes. She had heard every excuse in the book, but what he said next would change everything. The young man's voice wavered, but he stood his ground. "Your Honor, I know you see me as just another case, another mistake. But before you decide my fate, I need to tell you something. Something I've never said before." Judge Judy leaned forward slightly. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but for the first time, she hesitated. The courtroom was silent now. Even the faint whispers from the back had disappeared. The young man swallowed hard. His fingers trembled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded, time-worn piece of paper. He placed it carefully on the defendant's table. This is a letter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "From my mother. Before she died, she told me something I didn't want to believe. But I think you need to hear it too." Judge Judy exhaled slowly. She had seen all kinds of pleas in her time stories designed to gain sympathy, desperate attempts to sway judgment, but something about the way he spoke, something in his eyes, made her pause. She motioned for the bailiff to retrieve the letter. As she unfolded the fragile paper and her eyes scanned the words, her breath caught in her throat, because the name at the bottom of the letter was her own. Judge Judy's fingers tightened around the letter. The paper felt thin, fragile, as if it could crumble under the weight of the moment. Her eyes scanned the faded ink, the words written in careful, deliberate strokes. The name at the bottom sent a chill through her. It was her maiden name. The courtroom, once heavy with tension, now felt like it had stopped breathing entirely. The young man stood motionless, his hands gripping the edges of the table as if it was the only thing keeping him upright. "You knew my mother," he finally said, his voice unsteady. "Didn't you?" Judge Judy didn't answer right away. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure what to say. She looked back down at the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. A name from a past she had tried to leave behind. Memories flickered in her mind. A small apartment. A promise she had once made. A face she hadn't seen in decades. She lifted her gaze to meet his. "I did," she said finally, her voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it before. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. The young man stood there, his breathing uneven, his hands gripping the table as if holding himself together. "My mother always told me," he said, his voice quieter now, "that there was someone out there who could have helped us. Someone who had promised her once, a long time ago." Judge Judy's fingers pressed into the letter, the paper crinkling beneath her grip. Memories long buried began to stir. She had been young, ambitious, eager to make a difference. There had been a woman, desperate, afraid, who had come to her for help. She had promised. She had meant to follow through. But life had pulled them apart. Cases stacked up. Priorities shifted. And that promise, it had faded into the past. Now, standing before her was proof that promises were never truly forgotten. She looked at the young man again. For the first time, she truly saw him. The sharp angles of his face, the quiet determination in his eyes. The resemblance was undeniable. She had been so sure this was just another case, another lost soul standing before her. But this wasn't about the law anymore. This was unfinished business, and she had a choice to make. The courtroom felt smaller now, as if the weight of the moment had pressed the walls in around them. Judge Judy had faced thousands of cases, handed down thousands of rulings, but nothing had ever felt like this. She glanced at the letter again. The ink had faded, but the words still carried weight. A promise left unfulfilled. A life that could have been different. Her voice, usually sharp and unwavering, softened just slightly. Your mother, she was a good woman. The young man's throat bobbed as he swallowed. She believed in you. Judge Judy exhaled slowly. The audience was silent. Even those who had come expecting a fiery courtroom exchange sat still, sensing that something far more important was unfolding. Her gaze locked onto the young man. You stand before me with a record. Mistakes you've made. But I have to ask myself, if I had kept my promise, would you even be here today? The young man blinked rapidly, as if holding back years of unspoken words. I don't know, he admitted. But I do know this: everyone else gave up on me. She never did. And now, you have a choice. For the first time in a long time, Judge Judy wasn't thinking as a judge. She was thinking as a person, and she knew exactly what she had to do. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Every eye was on Judge Judy, waiting for her decision. But this wasn't just another ruling. This was something else entirely. She folded the letter carefully, placing it beside her gavel. Then, she looked up at the young man, no longer just a defendant, but a reminder of a past she had tried to forget. I've spent my life upholding the law, she said, her voice steady. But the law doesn't always account for what's right. And today, I'm making this decision not just as a judge, but as the person I should have been all those years. Ego. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The young man held his breath. You're not walking away from this, she continued, her gaze sharp. You will be held accountable, but not with a prison sentence. Instead, you will be placed into a rehabilitation program that you will complete. No exceptions. And when you do, I will personally see to it that you have the chance your mother always wanted for you. The young man's shoulders shook. His fingers curled against the table. For years, he whispered, I thought no one cared. Judge Judy leaned forward. I should have. And now, I will. The gavel came down. The verdict was final. But for the first time in his life, the young man realized this wasn't the end. It was a new beginning. The courtroom remained silent long after the gavel fell. The young man stood frozen, his mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. He had spent his entire life expecting disappointment, preparing for doors to close before he could even reach them. But today, a door had opened. Judge Judy watched him carefully. She had spent decades delivering verdicts, believing justice was a balance of fairness and accountability. But this was something different. This was a promise she had made long ago, finally honored. As the bailiff signaled for the next case, the young man slowly stepped back from the podium. His fingers brushed against the folded letter still resting on the judge's bench. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope. And this brings us to the end of this story. If this touched your heart, take a moment to reflect and share this video with someone who might need it today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more inspiring stories. See you next time.